I've always been fascinated by the old ways. Whenever I was a little kid, I used to love listening to my older grandparents and great grandparents talking about how when they were little, a lot of them grew up in places like this, one room shanties, two room shanties, didn't have any electricity. And they were essentially living like the early frontiersmen did up until electricity finally came to this part of Pennsylvania and the Appalachians, and things slowly became modernized. And I used to love listening to them talk about just how things were. And this was long before I had ever heard of any sort of off grid, that terminology or that concept, before YouTube and social media were around to kind of popularize that. I had no idea about any of that. I just knew things like this as how the old timers did. And then in the late 90s, my grandparents, this is their property, they ended up having this built as a place to where they could come to during hunting season just to get warmed up, and then we would have family parties here. But I used to love just on weekends and evenings getting home from school, every chance I had, I loved coming back here. I grew up just a quarter of a mile through the woods, and I would walk back here. I just loved just sitting on the porch or sitting out in the yard area here and just coming in, and there's no electricity, no running water. And I would sometimes spend the day, sometimes spend the night, have some buddies over. You just come back here and sit around the wood stove. And I just loved it. It was awesome. And then in 2002, I was in the Navy. This was my second year that I was in. Whenever I would come home on weekends, I got stationed in Virginia, so I could drive up here, about 6-hour drive, come up here. And I didn't have a house up here at the time, so grandparents told me I could stay back here. And that's what I would do. I would come up at least 2 or 3 times a month. And then whenever I'd get 30 days of leave over holidays and sometimes in the summer, just come up here and live off grid. I had no concept, again, of that lifestyle. So I would try to recreate with kerosene lanterns and candles, and then some modern inventions of battery powered lights. And for the most part, I tried to recreate what it would be like 100 years ago to live in a place like this. Because they had originally intended this area for family gatherings, they ended up getting a pavilion in, which I don't own it, so I didn't have any say. It is what it is. The Lonesome Dove is where I spent almost every weekend from 2002 through 2008, in the 30 days of leave and your Christmas break, New Year's break. And during that time, YouTube was just starting to get up running, but again, I didn't watch any of the off-grid stuff, had no concept of that. Read some of the Foxfire books, talking to the old timers. I mostly put my focus on primitive skills. I love going out, staying in debris huts, and whenever I would stay here, this always felt like glamping to me, and learned a lot as far as, okay, lighting, different candles, how the kerosene lanterns, and then your food storage, food preparation, hygiene, sanitation with the bathroom. There's an old porta-john converted into an outhouse back in there. And just your common everyday living. For a while when I was on leave in the summertime, I had a place set up where I had the washboard in the tub and do your laundry there and setting that out on the clotheslines, and just kind of basic day-to-day living like that. And of course, I'd go to visit my parents just through the woods and sometimes use the shower there, sometimes eat supper. So I wasn't totally isolated and contained and self-sufficient here. Again, I didn't own it, so I couldn't plant a garden. I couldn't put animals here. This was just the primary focus of this place was for the family gatherings, but they were nice enough to let me stay here. And I loved it, and I miss this place. Actually, it was kind of emotional coming here because I haven't been here in a couple years, and it's changed a lot just with the different furniture and things on it, and it's getting overgrown around places. But it was a lot of time was spent here, and it definitely learned a lot. And just sitting on a porch and playing music, that's another thing. I'd play music with friends here, and just I really want to build something like this someday. This is the same table and chairs that I had A lot of the other furniture was added after I moved out of here. Rocking chair's still the same, and I had a bunk bed over here as well. And there's the old wood stove. One of the things I learned early on my first year staying here was the importance of insulation. When this place was first built, there were just gaps between the rafters and the outside, and it didn't matter how hot you had the wood stove, it just wouldn't hold any heat, and you were freezing all the time. So the first winter staying here, me and Dad, we ran insulation in the ceiling and then got boards and tacked them in, and that made a world of a difference. It still got cold. There's no insulation in the walls. I like the old look, and my grandma liked the old look, and I didn't want to change anything in there. So it's batten board, but even still, you'd be sitting there, and sometimes the wind would be blowing, and you'd see the candles flickering. So that it wasn't 100% insulated, and the floors, there's no insulation, and they're up on blocks, and so you got the draft blowing under there. But just putting insulation in the ceiling really helped out a lot. And then you just put your bunk bed by the wood stove, and that tended to keep you warm for the most part in the wintertime. These are nice nostalgic stoves, but they don't hold much firewood. And one of the things I learned was you had to set your alarm in the middle of the night, especially in the really cold winter nights, and get up and put more firewood in. Otherwise, early morning, you'd wake up from your face being so cold because the fire had gone out. It was very quiet here. Sometimes you'd hear traffic out on the road, but I didn't have any electricity, so there was no refrigerator running, no background hum from different computers, and you didn't have a TV. And so you just could relax and just decompress and sit here and read. And when someone would come over, you would visit, you would talk, and you wouldn't be on your cell phone. And read a lot here, and it was nice. It was nice to just that simple lifestyle of just living in the moment. And I know it's cliche to talk about simple living and the different philosophies that go along with off-grid and old school living, but it's the truth. If you're going to go somewhere and live a lifestyle, even for just a weekend, and you're exposed to the cold and to the heat, and you don't have the common comforts of life, then you need to have some sort of philosophy that you're going for. Whether it's the old school living, whether you're just wanting to test yourself to see how you do dealing with discomforts, or whatever you come up with. And this is before the tiny house movement, so a lot of my buddies and folks I was in the Navy with gave me a lot of crap and called this the Unabomber Shack. So it was funny, and I took it because, I mean, whatever. I loved coming here, and it was funny. It was. And now that the movement's popularized, things like this are a bit more accepted at the time. It is kind of funny how, early 2000s, this was made fun of, called Unabomber Shack. And 20th century lifestyle like this, I mean, you were looked down upon by society if you were off-grid, living the old ways or anything like that. I mean, you were looked down upon. And it's kind of funny that now how popular off-grid and living compressed and tiny and simple, how that's popular now, especially with YouTube and other social media, that it's just funny how things come full circle, that folks in rural areas really tried to get away from stuff like this. And then folks in the burbs and in the, city areas are trying to come out and live stuff like this. I just think that's kind of ironic how things pan out like that. There used to be an old glider swing that would set here with the campfire area. Things have been shifted around a little bit. And in the summertime, I would spend a lot of the nights out here just sitting, looking up at the stars, looking at the campfire, sometimes visiting with friends, most of the time just by myself. And there was no outside light pollution. There were, no pole lights here. And nearest houses quite a ways through the woods. And you just sit here, just look at the stars, look at the moon. And again, not to get all cliche and philosophical, but there's something about being out away from everything. It doesn't have to be a remote wilderness. You can hear the Pennsylvania Turnpike 6 miles away, and there's houses just a few hundred yards away. It's not wilderness, but you don't have the light pollution. So being outside at night, you can see the stars, you could hear the birds and the other animals. My great-grandfather made this chair years before I was ever born. And these pews, they're from my church that was built in 1842, and they're the original pews. And so it's nice having a lot of nostalgia, a lot of memory. I really want to encourage people that don't own any land to still go out and try to experience this. Whether there's a relative or a friend that owns some property that you can come out on, or maybe you have to rent a cabin in a state park or find an Airbnb, still go out there and don't get discouraged, don't get overwhelmed. I know there's a lot of high-speed stuff on the internet and on some of these reality shows that can seem like it gets a bit overwhelming. And you'll see people living way out into the bush in Alaska or Montana or someplace, and you think, man, I mean, what could I, how am I ever going to do anything like that? I live in the suburbs and I don't own any land. Well, I've been coming out since the late 90s. More than half my life, I've been coming out on weekends and sometimes a month at a time. There was a time where in 2018, I spent several months at a time just living completely in a tent. And so, I mean, does that still make me a part-timer? I mean, whatever, I don't really care. I've still learned a lot, and it's been more than half my life living in conditions like this because I enjoy it. And there's not, for me, it's just the nostalgia and just the enjoyment of it, to where, again, find your philosophy, find your why, why you want to live this sort of lifestyle, and just experience it, and then just go do it. Learn all you can. Read. YouTube is great for inspiration, and you can learn a couple tips that maybe stuff in a book. The drawings aren't the best, but definitely read books on how to do stuff and get inspiration from books. Foxfire books are great, and there's other books out there. And then also, too, if you can find some old timers, the old timers are the best. The ones that were still alive when their parents and their grandparents grew up living the old ways, that they did it out of survival, they did it out of necessity. The Great Smoky Mountains down in Gatlinburg, Tennessee is a great place to go out and just to walk in and experience that they were poor folks. They couldn't afford to buy a lot of the fancy gadgets that are part of the off-grid movement. They did with what they had to do. And so maybe you want to live that old school life, or it's just the off-grid of, you want to purchase everything. And that's fine. That's totally fine. But just go out there and do it, even if it is just a weekend. I wish I'd have taken more pictures when I was here, but I didn't. Most of my pictures are in my memory, and I don't think I even took any video. I looked in the hard drive, and I can't find any video. And I'm really glad that YouTube and the off-grid movement weren't a thing at the time, though, because I don't know how things would have turned out. Even now, kind of filming some of this stuff, it makes it feel kind of fake, kind of cheesy, kind of Hollywood. But it is what it is. I don't stay here anymore. This is just a shell of the past now. Things look a lot different, and it's just not the same. I learned a lot. It taught me a lot as a man, and a lot of good memories here, and it's good enough for me.